the examining hockey as a family sport of sports does have some value added for the students. So obviously, one of the things we go into at the beginning is the origins of the hockey sports, and certain aspects of that are well known. It's very well known that there are vernacular stick sports you can find in a whole variety of global cultures going over thousands of years, so that that is one of the origins, and there's nothing very new in that. Very important, but also has been explored by historians such as Cheryl Maloney and Paul Bennett, the Mi'kmaq origins, that very important to the origins of ice hockey in particular, were the Mi'kmaq sporting origins of the sport. But where an openness to a variety of sports, I think, does have some real impact in this area is with sports such as hurley and cricket. Hurley, obviously the same word as hurling, was essentially a playground sport played by children and young people on land, but with sticks and a ball, that contributed to the emergence of ice hockey as a sport that could be played on ice as a counterpart to the sport played on land. And also, this is going beyond the hockey sports themselves, but also the role of cricket as a crossover sport through the vernacular sport of wicket that also contributed to the origins of ice hockey. Diffusion. Sport diffusion, one of the central elements of the study of sport history, historically and historiographically. And diffusion, I would suggest, really can be approached very productively from the point of view of the family of sports. One of the reasons for that is that the gender implications can be approached through studying diffusion, particularly in the context that diffusion of field hockey took place in a particularly important way through diffusion into North America from European origins, especially through the efforts of Constance Appleby as a coach. And so comparison of that kind of diffusion with, say, the diffusion of ice hockey to places in North America and ultimately also in particularly Northern Europe, that is an important and I think a powerful form of comparison. The diffusion of bandy, first from being a Celtic sport, then to being an English sport during the Little Ice Age, and then into Northern Europe. Again, important in the sense that we can gauge the climatic implications of sport diffusion. And also another comparison with the sports that did not significantly diffuse, particularly shinty in Scotland and hurling in Ireland. I just mentioned gender, and obviously study of the gender characteristics of any sport is critical to understanding its history. And it's an area where there are very different patterns in the various hockey sports. Internationalization, for example, quite different gender patterns of internationalization between, say, field hockey and ice hockey. Women's hockey, also in both ice hockey and field hockey, very important to the development of college and university sport, again, offering very important comparisons. And then also the development of a separate sport for girls and young women in the case of ringette, again, offering a particular case study. Also in terms of the social history of sport, race and ethnicity, and social class. So that while in some aspects hockey sports can be characterized by certain forms of cultural appropriation, perhaps in terms of the transition from indigenous to non-indigenous sports. And yet in other contexts, particularly in India, a sport, namely field hockey, was taken over from its colonial origins and was used in a way that affirmed Indianness. And so in both cases, sports evolved from one group to another, and yet there is a distinction. And it's an important way, I think, of getting the students to reflect on what that distinction is. And obviously the general question, who gets to play, how and why do these patterns develop, as well as, particularly in terms of social class, comparing the expense of playing sports and how that impacts impacts on the participation. Nationality and decolonization. Ice hockey, as we all know, often referred to as Canada's game. And yet Russia's game, particularly in the earlier part of the 20th century and going towards the Summit Series of 1972, Russia's game would be bandy. Ireland's game, hurling, particularly along with the other Gaelic Athletic Association sports in Ireland's struggle for independence. And then finally, India's game, field hockey, very important to the integrity of India's movement towards independence and decolonization. Internationalization again and professionalization, where once again there are quite different patterns. The international role of the National Hockey League, the international role of the Olympics, bandy with direct crossover, particularly through the Summit Series of 1972, from one form of hockey sport to another, and also the potential contrast with the sports that remained amateur and do remain amateur despite being critically important in very key national contexts, namely shinty and hurling. So that most students come into the course initially familiar primarily or perhaps only with ice hockey. History is about the questions who, what, where, why, when, but especially why. And in examining the why of the development of the hockey sports, comparison, I would suggest, is a powerful instrument of analysis. So that not only does the study of the hockey sports together make sense as a grouping, but also it enhances our understanding of each one of the individual sports, ice hockey and all the others, and that really is the basis of the teaching of this course. Thank you very much.
So Jonathon, over to you.
John, did you want to take questions, or are we going to save questions until after all the presentations are done? How do you think we should do this?
I don't really mind. I mean, I was going on the assumption that we would probably have a general Q&A after the presentations, but fine with me either way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm kind of wondering just offhand if Mike isn't here because we're on Eastern time here in Ontario, and I wonder if he thinks that noon meant noon here as opposed to noon there. So I still haven't heard anything from him, so I'm not sure what to say about that.
I tell you what, Jonathan, why don't you go ahead and present, and I'll fire off an email to Mike and see if he receives that.
Okay. All right, I will need a second to get my screen ready, but
if not all of us were introduced to hockey history through the works of talented popular historians. In my case, it was stories and books from authors like Stan Fisher and Brian McFarlane. They were fascinating stories, no question. They ought to be for life. But when I started to get serious about hockey history, I came to realize that a lot of stories that have been accepted as fact are problematic from an academic standpoint, because it's difficult to prove that they actually happened. Sometimes stories take on lives of their own, like the tall tale about Cyclone Taylor skating backwards through an opposing team and scoring a goal. Taylor acknowledged many times that it didn't really happen like that, but the legend has persisted nevertheless. This is true in other fields as well. There's a funny story in which Jonathon supposedly once asked if Ringo Starr was the best drummer in the world, to which John's reply was Ringo wasn't even the best drummer in the Beatles. The story has been widely shared as an example not only of John's concerted wit, but also of Ringo's alleged deficiencies as a drummer. There's no evidence that the story is true, and Beatles historians are adamant that John Lennon would never have said such a thing. I've spent the past few years researching Happy for various projects, such as getting him elected to the Sports Hall of Fame in our mutual hometown, Owen Sound, Ontario. He's the main focus of my master's thesis, which I'll be finishing this summer. So in looking at the issue of legend versus fact in popular hockey history, I found that Happy is at the center of a number of stories that I felt were worth exploring. I'd like to take a look at 3 of those stories with you today. Lloyd Stanowski. They won Stanley Cups together with the Leafs in the 1940s, Day as the coach and Stanowski as one of his defensemen. The popular story is that as Day was coming to the end of his playing career, the Leafs traded him to the New York Americans for Stanowski. Day himself appeared to believe that to be the case. He was interviewed for a book that was published in 1984, and he talked about the trade, noting that he had been sent packing along with teammate King Clancy. But the evidence doesn't support that story. Here we see some contemporary news articles detailing how Day and a different teammate named Jack Schill became the property of the New York Americans in 1937. It seems clear from reading these articles that Day was granted free agency so that he could pursue his own contract with the Americans. Schill was sold for cash, or so it appeared at first glance. As it turned out, he was sold to New York. Incidentally, the Leafs released King Clancy at the same time to become the coach of the soon-to-be defunct Montreal Maroons. He retired from the NHL a year earlier and was never the property of the Americans. By 1941, with Schill out of the NHL and Stanowski having blossomed into an all-star defenseman with the Leafs, it was being stated that he had been traded to the Leafs for the man who had since become his coach. This story became widely accepted as fact, and these articles are just a couple of examples of that. The Society for International Hockey Research, unfortunately, is not able to provide any recovery. We can see here in Stanowski's player profile on the Society's website that he was traded to Toronto for Happy Day and King Clancy, matching what Day apparently believed to be true. In Day's profile, the Society notes that his contract was sold to the Americans, which is what the first batch of articles said. No mention of a trade, no mention of Wally Stanowski. Schill's profile, the Society wants to have it both ways. He was sold, or he was traded for Stanowski. They're not sure which. Honestly, it's a bit of a mess. I contacted the NHL office in Toronto to see if there were any surviving transaction records that would clear up the mystery, but I never got a response. But I think we can presume, based on reading of the primary sources, the first set of articles, that Hat Day was not, in fact, traded to the New York Americans for Wally Stanowski or for anyone else. The whole thing is kind of a sad footnote to Dave's playing career. He played only one summer season in New York and retired at the end of the 1937-38 season. As good as Dave was as a player, he was good enough to be on the Hall of Fame. He was even better as a coach. He won 5 Stanley Cups for coaching beliefs, which was a record at the time, and is still third in NHL history among coaches. He was the first coach to win 3 consecutive championships. Even more impressively, he never lost in the Stanley Cup Final, and that's something no other coach with 4 or more cup wins can claim. His unlikeliest cup win as a coach was his second victory in 1945, led by a 26-year-old rookie netminder who was plagued with stomach ulcers. Frank McCool battled through the physical and mental pain and carried the Leafs through the regular season and into the final series against the Detroit Red Wings. He was in constant agony. The Leafs won the final series 4 games to 3. What McCool is said to have done in Game 7 seems like it's right out of a Hollywood screenplay. I'll give you a couple of seconds to read this Maclean's magazine account from 10 years later by legendary Canadian sports writer Trent Flynn. As you read it, you understand this is blockbuster-worthy material, completely dialogue that no sports writer could have easily overheard. As it turns out, like most blockbusters, the story is more fiction than fact. It is based in reality. There's plenty of documentation showing that McCool did briefly abandon his plan due to a roiling stomach. But what the primary sources tell us is that it happened in the second period of Game 2, not in the third period of Game 7. Given the attention paid by the media to what McCool did in Game 2, it's reasonable to assume that this coverage would have been even more intense if he repeated the action in the final period of the final game with the series and the Stanley Cup on the line. Only one delay is reported to have taken place in that contest. While it did result in a brief stoppage, McCool did not leave the ice, and therefore Coach Hat Day did not have to follow him to the dressing room in order to coax him back out. We can safely presume that the account written by Trent Flynn did not happen. Despite that, I still think there's a screenplay to be written here, and if you want to collaborate with me on it, you'll find my contact info at the end of this presentation. The legend most closely associated with Hat Day is the 1942 Stanley Cup Final, in which the Leafs dropped the first 3 games of the series and then came back to win the next 4 games and the cup. This achievement has been repeated a couple of times in the playoffs since then, but it has never happened again in the final series. What we know for sure is that Dave overhauled his lineup after Game 3, benching his top scorer and his best defenseman. This seemed like a hopeless strategy at the time, but it paid off. There was also the matter of a letter that, according to legend, was written by a McCool who pleaded with the Leafs to come back and win. Dave, so the story goes, read the letter aloud to his team in the dressing room in the moments before the start of Game 4. It had the desired effect. The girl was identified in the Toronto Daily Star as Doris Klein, a young girl who lived in Toronto, and what you're seeing here is the only contemporary publication of her name. The headline, as you see, mentions her pen note, but it doesn't elaborate on what she's said to have written. The story took on mythic proportions in years after the 1942 final, even though the details changed. The most common changes have been to the girl's age and hometown. There are way too many published articles to show here, but depending on who's telling the story and when they're telling it, Doris Klein was anywhere from 11 to 15 years old, and she either lived in Toronto or she lived in Detroit. Look at that closing line, reportedly conveying the second of her. You failed this child. More brilliant and possibly worth stepped forward again to claim responsibility for having written the letter. Speaking as a professional, the popular history is a story that cannot be proven either way. Personally, though, I think it happened. The published photo is compelling. So too is the fact that Day and many of his players, all of whom are also now dead, never disavowed the story. If there was a conspiracy between Day and the Leafs to never reveal the truth, they pulled it off on revenge, but I don't think that's what happened. Hockey history is by and large been available to the historians, but that's changing. Access to primary sources allows us to explore many of the game's stories and to try to figure out how factual they really are. In a changing world where truth is an increasingly precious commodity, this presentation is intended as a contribution to a more accurate and definitive scholarly history of hockey. I hope I've demonstrated how the hockey historical record should be challenged by academic researchers and, if necessary, corrected or at least clarified.
Thanks very much, Jonathan.
I tried to record it with a microphone, but it wasn't working, so I do apologize for the audio issues there.
So I did send an email to Mike, but no response yet. I mean, he may yet join, but perhaps I might suggest that we open it up for comments and questions. And usually there's the chat and the Q&A, so people could either use the chat and it'll come up on the screen if it's directed to everyone, or simply, we're a small group, so simply unmute and perhaps put on the camera as well. And I'm sure we're both really happy to have any comments or questions. So the floor is open.
Yeah, since we're down one presenter, would Jonathan mind, if it's not too much to ask, maybe just giving a brief summary of the key points again? I'm really sorry to ask you to do this, but maybe it's because we do have a bit of extra time. Maybe you wouldn't mind doing that.
Yeah, I really apologize. I tried to hook up a microphone to record this morning. I could not get my computer to recognize the mic, so I had to use the built-in audio, and obviously it did not work the way I wanted it to. To summarize my argument, basically it was using Hap Day and some stories, some legendary stories that he's connected to, and using primary sources to try to determine whether or not those stories are actually true. There are a lot of stories over the years that, you know, they're really entertaining, they're really fascinating, but we can't necessarily be sure that they're true. And as I've evolved from popular hockey history to academic history, it's become more important for me to make sure that things are true that I'm writing about. So that's where my presentation is coming from. So the three stories that I chose were: was he in fact traded to the New York Americans for Wally Stanowski in 1937? I determined that no, he was not. The 1945 Stanley Cup Final, Frank McCool was said to have abandoned his net in the middle of the third period of Game 7. With the game tied, the series tied, the Stanley Cup on the line, I was able to determine that it did not happen like that. He did abandon his net briefly in Game 2, but that didn't make for quite as much of a dramatic effect as the popular version that emerged later, which I think should probably be turned into a movie. And the third story I used was the 1942 Stanley Cup Final, where the Leafs lost the first 3 games, then came back and won the next 4 games and won the cup. And of course, there's the legend of the girl who wrote the letter to the Leafs begging them to make their comeback. And no one has ever really determined whether that girl was real, whether the letter was real. I did find a picture of her and her name in the Toronto Star on one instance. It's the only instance I was ever able to find of this girl, Doris Klein, ever having existed. So even though we can't necessarily prove that it's true, we can't disprove it either. My feeling from a personal, if not professional standpoint, is that the story did happen. The published photo is compelling evidence that it did happen. Day never disavowed the story. None of the team members ever disavowed the story, which leads me to think that if it wasn't true and if there was a conspiracy among Day and Elise to not tell the truth, they pulled it off remarkably. I'm sure we've all had group meetings where we couldn't get everybody on the same page, but for 15 players and a coach to keep that secret for the rest of their lives, I just don't see that's possible. So I think the story happened. And my summary was basically just what I said about how we can use primary sources more than we were able to in the past with newspapers.com, other resources like that. So we have access to primary sources that we didn't necessarily have in the past. And we can use them to try to determine the veracity of a lot of the popular hockey stories that we love. And I think that it's incumbent upon us as researchers to do that whenever we can, just again for the sake of accuracy, to make sure that what we're saying, what we're telling people is as accurate as we can determine that it is. So there's the Coles Notes version of my presentation. Hopefully, I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has, man.
Jonathon, if we were having this conference 50 years from now, who are the people we would be trying to sort out the truth and the myth from? I mean, one would obviously be Harold Ballard. There are lots of stories about him, but can you think of others, and even maybe contemporary people, where the myth grows so quickly?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure that the conditions could ever be the same again, just because we're in such a media saturated hockey world now. I mean, like, it seems like there's nothing that happens that people don't know about almost instantly. So it's really hard to say. I mean, I guess there might be stories coming from the dressing room, like what really happened to get Mike Babcock fired from the Leafs. I mean, like, I guess there's something, just because we hear stories doesn't necessarily mean that we're flies on the wall. So I guess there will always be some sort of speculation as to what. I don't really know if I can say 50 years from now what we'll be talking about, other than why has it been over 100 years since the Leafs won the Stanley Cup.
I like you more and more every time you say anything.
Kennedy's just looking for a magazine story here, so don't feed him any ideas that are really good, valuable.
Well, there's stuff like the Islanders ice bags story, right? That supposedly they wandered by the dressing room of the Oilers and saw the ice bags. And I've talked to some of those people, and that isn't necessarily how it happened. So I agree with your point about this surfeit of information, but it might even be worse now, though. I mean, there's so many, and I talked about this in my paper yesterday, there's so much information, it's almost more difficult to sort.
Well, I'm
not a professional historian, you guys are.
That's a really fair point, actually. Yeah, I mean, it is hard to, it has changed. I mean, back then we got newspapers, and newspaper reporters back in the old days, they wrote what they wanted to, whether it was true or not. Conn Smythe used to brag that he could get the Toronto papers to print anything he wanted for $50. Nowadays, is there too much info? Is it difficult to sift through it all? Probably, yeah. It's things certainly have changed, and maybe we don't necessarily know anymore than we might have in the 1960s or previous to that.
I suppose that there's another dimension to it also, that as well as having to verify what took place and what may not have taken place, There's also the dimension as to the legends themselves, what their role was, why they became well-known stories. That, again, I think is a really interesting part, Jonathan, of what you're describing here. To throw in a rough parallel from field hockey in 1936 in the Olympic tournament, after India had defeated Germany by 8-1. There was a well-known story that circulated in India that the star Indian player Dhyan Chand had been offered at the highest level a commission in the German army on the basis that he would then play hockey for Germany, and turned it down. So saying, well, no, I'm quite happy with my friends where I am, thank you very much. And it is very clear from the evidence that that never happened. And yet just the sort of context of that in a kind of decolonization context is, I think, really significant just in itself as a popular legend.
John, can I ask you about your course? I teach a hockey course as well. It's a little different in that it's a sort of it's a freshman writing skills seminar that happens to be about hockey. So I shoehorned a history course into a gen ed class. But what are the parts of the course that your students are actually most interested in, and the ones that you find hardest for them to embrace or to connect with?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, the first thing is that, as I mentioned, a lot of them, I mean, almost all come in with a certain knowledge of hockey in the North American sense. Often they are hockey fans, and that can be a good thing or a not so good thing. It's a not so good thing if that indicates a kind of exclusive interest, but it's a great thing if the students really build on that to sort of understand the depth of why a sport develops as it does. So I think initially, particularly say in sports like shinty or hurling, there's a real sort of adjustment, and at first students are not sure about this comparative dimension. There's no doubt that ice hockey topics interest them throughout. And, the Summit series is an obvious one where, the students are, with a few exceptions, far too young to have any living memory of that, but there's definitely a kind of inherited memory. So there's a kind of excitement, when I play Phil Esposito's famous interview after Game 4, and that really is of interest. And then similarly, the Richard riot, I mean, that always is a high point. But I do find that they also find the Indian field hockey experience to be interesting in the sense that it's international. It's something that they can parallel to the increasing international role of the NHL, and sort of make that distinction as to why that takes place. So I would say that in terms of the comparative sports, that's probably the most compelling story for the students. And to some degree, they become more and more interested the further in time we go, and the course comes more or less up to the present day. But I would say that particularly for the students who are inclined to take a sort of analytical basis on the question why, once they get past the initial adjustment, then there's a fairly sort of even level of interest that develops.
John, just to follow up on Andy's question and your presentation, but particularly with respect to the notion of the family of sports, many of us have over the years taught courses on the history of sport in a broader context. How would you see the notion of the family of sports as an organizing principle for a broader study of sport history? I'm thinking of water sports, field sports, snow sports, alpine sports, whatever. What have you thought about that? And have you ever actually taught a broader course in sport history?
No, I never have. And now, of course, there is a very fine tradition at St. Mary's, and there's one particular person who is just about single-handedly responsible for the high quality of that tradition. And so, Colin, I'm very much sort of inspired by your example in sport history. But no, I mean, as you know and others know, I mean, I'm pretty much a latecomer to this field. So the only courses I've taught are courses in the history of hockey and another one on the history of football, which likewise takes that broader approach. And you know, I would say that it certainly is a viable principle. I'm sure it's not the only way to approach the broader field, but it would be one way. And to some degree, I think, I mean, one of the fascinations, I think, of teaching sport history is to put across the sort of complementary idea that, in a sense, you know, all sport history is quite a simple form of human activity that's being portrayed, because you know we're all physical creatures. Our bodies demand that we engage in sporting activities of one kind or another, and that's a major reason why, you know, in any human society, and maybe I'm overgeneralizing here, but it seems to be in any human society you will find sports, just as you will find education and you'll find religion. So that there is a kind of breadth, I think, there. And the idea of the family of sports, I think, draws in part on just the simple idea of stick sports, or the simple idea of people using their feet to kick a round, or perhaps not quite round, shaped object. And the ones you've mentioned similarly would draw upon certain kinds of movement. So there's the simpler dimension of just the way in which sports and pastimes are so crucial to humans. But then, of course, there's the essential and much more diverse and complex question of how that gets expressed, and the various disciplines that grow up, and the codified versions in more recent times. So that I think that the concept could certainly fit into that broader range that you mentioned, although I'm sure also there are many, many ways of doing so.
I have a question for John too, if I may. A very specific one. This past winter, I was asked to give a presentation about winter sports for local students in translation and interpretation. It was an exercise for them to practice specific terminology. I was asked to talk about ice hockey, figure skating, and curling. So 3 sports, but I had to cram them into 2 separate speeches. And I hesitated about putting figure skating and ice hockey together because they're sports that you really need to skate, or are hockey and curling more similar? Because is curling a stick sport? Does that belong in this family? And to what extent do you see figure skating and ice hockey as members of the same family? I'd be interested to know and how you would have paired them. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean the concept of a stick sport, which is fairly important to my course. I mean, it is to a certain degree an arbitrary kind of unifying principle, and figure skating, in terms of that idea of stick sports, no, I wouldn't. I mean, I'd see it as very closely allied in terms of being a sport on ice. But I think also being a team sport in a certain sense is crucial also. And while clearly you can have team approaches to figure skating, it's not quite the same kind of team. So now curling is really important, and obviously curling, like hockey or like cricket in a different way, I mean, these all are in part settler sports in a Canadian sense. And so there's a real affinity there. I mean, I guess I wouldn't see it as a stick sport in the same sense, although, you know, I totally see the point that the connection that you're making there. The other one that I at the beginning I kind of agonized over was lacrosse. Because you know, obviously there are some real affinities there, and to include lacrosse would also open up some whole other possibilities with respect to Indigenous sport and the Indigenous tradition. But I guess my decision was that the course was already becoming diffuse as it was. And although I do actually always mention lacrosse fairly prominently as well. So those are the kinds of distinctions that I would make. But, you know, I mean, I totally, you know, sympathize with your dilemma and the invitation you receive, because it's always difficult to draw the precise distinctions in these areas.
That was very interesting and enlightening. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to add before we end that I explained in my presentation, which obviously probably didn't get heard, why I chose Hap Day as my focal point. I've been researching him quite a bit for the past few years. He's the main subject of my master's thesis that I'm going to be completing this summer. But really, the stuff I'm talking about could be applied to pretty much any, you know, hockey figure from the past, you know, like Maurice Richard, Gordie Howe, Bobby Orr, Wayne Gretzky. There are probably tons of stories, you know, that have been accepted into the popular culture, but may not necessarily be accurate. So that Hap Day was just my personal choice, but really it could apply to just about anybody from hockey's past.
Maybe I could just pose a question there. That one of the interesting things that comes out, I think, from your presentation is the way that Hap Day, you know, which would be true of other players who were players and coaches, really spans different eras in NHL history. And what I'm wondering is, did you have a sense that the kind of legendary Hap Day in the earlier era was similar or different from the legendary Hap Day as the years and the eras went by?
It's difficult to say because Hap was notoriously reporter shy. He did not really like speaking to reporters. And of course, he had Conn Smythe there to hog the spotlight. So it actually worked out quite well from that standpoint. Unfortunately, what I think it resulted in was Hap maybe not having the kind of legacy that a Dick Irvin or a Toe Blake necessarily had ended up with, or a Scotty Bowman in more modern times. So I think he's really an underrated coach. It just always seemed to me that, you know, when you talk about Leafs dynasties, it's punch him out in the 60s. Maybe it's because that's more recent, so it's more present in people's memories. But I don't know. I've just got a soft spot for Hap Day, probably because we're from the same hometown, and that's where my research started, trying to get him inducted into our Sports Hall of Fame.
Interesting that you mentioned the sort of interaction with reporters, and I was kind of thinking about this during Brian's presentation yesterday, and some of the sort of dressing room interviews that that Foster Hewitt did in a very innovative way during the 30s. But it was very, very difficult for him to, prompt most of the certainly the players to to be really forthcoming. And it's I played one of these interviews, or a series of interviews, in the course. And I think for the students, it's a really interesting contrast with the kind of media coverage and its rapid evolution that Brian brought out so well yesterday.
It's really true, because players and coaches back then really didn't have the media training that they have now. There were really no PR people sort of buffering between reporters and hockey figures. And really, too, as I said before, reporters back then reported what they thought sounded good, whether it was necessarily accurate or not. And again, Conn Smythe would brag in his autobiography that the Toronto papers would print whatever he wanted if he paid them $50 or some other kind of perk. So it's really interesting, to look back to see what sorts of things were being said, were being told to reporters, what reporters were just maybe making up. It's such a different time. It doesn't seem like that long ago, but it seems almost like another world, really.
John, can I just go back to your course and ask you, what do you do with artifacts? Or is that part of what the historical pedagogy would be? So do you bring in a cricket bat and let them touch and handle it? Or how do you sort of connect them to the physical, tangible aspects of teaching?
Yeah, well, I don't bring them in, and that's a really good idea. But I do try to a certain degree create that. I mean, one of the as Ryan Francis brought out in his presentation, one of the Mi'kmaq roles that was very important in the early development of hockey was not only in the origins of the sport itself, in part as a Mi'kmaq sport, but also in the making of the highest quality hockey sticks. And so I do show advertisements for the so-called Micmac hockey stick, and try to describe it, partly also in the context of the very rare and occasional discovery of a really sort of ancient Mi'kmaq hockey stick. So try to present a kind of visual and word picture in that regard. Another one that I use is in sledge hockey, or now known more properly as para ice hockey, the way in which the equipment evolved, and the way in which initially the equipment was really put together in a very sort of hasty and ad hoc way, but then evolved into very sophisticated equipment. So I suppose that those are the ways in which I do deal with the, or examples of the ways, the artifactual history. But it's a really good idea to take a more sort of hands-on kind of approach. So thank you.
Because I was thinking the other day about the kinetic, and somebody in yesterday's sessions called it kinesthetic elements of it. When you, in some ways, if you've never handled a hockey stick, you haven't had, I know this is a simplistic way of saying it, but it's sort of prototypical Canadian experience is to handle a hockey stick, right? But even handling today's hockey stick, which is a $200 piece of graphite or whatever, is different from handling one like those ones in your driveway, probably sitting there right now if you're still, that's the inside story, right? John Reid's driveway.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Brian. Actually, it's they've now formed almost a sculpture.
Like he was using a wood stick and then went to the Easton aluminum shafted one or whatever. That's a different game to play than a wispy little twig that weighs nothing, like what the players use now.
Yeah, really good point. And one thing I do try to do in the course is to also show the distinctions between the different sticks used in the different sports and the way they evolve and shape over time. But again, I think that's great. I think I probably could do more in terms of the evolution. I mean, even from the say the early 1970s to the 21st century.
I have a little story that talks to notions of hockey legends and stories that really couldn't be told, but in fact were told at the original hockey conference in 2001 when Austin Willis gave a concluding address to the conference, and he had been on hockey's Hot Stove League broadcasts in the 40s. And he told a story in a speech of George Raff, the Hollywood actor and famous Hollywood tough guy, coming to Toronto. And Austin said, "Well, I'll take you up, and we'll visit Foster Hewitt in the gondola." And Raff said, "Okay." And so they start up this rickety ladder towards the gondola, and George Raff, the tough guy, got halfway up and froze, and they couldn't get him to either step down or step up. Whether or not that was to some extent exaggerated by Austin or not, but it was a great story and part of even the history of this conference.
I've heard that story too. It's a great one. I had never heard that anyone had actually witnessed it, but I'm inclined to believe it. It's apparently that trip to the gondola was pretty nerve-wracking for anybody other than Foster Hewitt.
Right.
A question in the chat from Jason about whether there are any sports that the students in the course really don't take seriously. That's a really interesting question, and I think the answer is no, that they do take them all seriously. Obviously I can't speak for the students, and there may be other impressions sort of out there, but I think that there are forms of hockey in the course that they know very little about and may have some preconceptions about. And one of the things I do very close to the beginning is that I do introduce the various sports. And for example, for field hockey, I play a sort of a highlights reel of the goals from both the most recent men's and women's World Cup. And it's a very fast sport played on artificial turf. And although I warn the students, look, this is a highlights reel, I mean, it's not all as exciting as this. Nevertheless, I think it does help to create in them the sense that this is a thoroughly modern, fast sport that perhaps is not the impression they have of field hockey originally. And another example would be shinty, which is, as people will know, is very much still a community-based sport, largely in the north of Scotland. And so I show film that shows that. But I remember years ago when I and my family were traveling in Scotland, and my son, a hockey player, and his first impression was that the sort of hand-eye coordination in Shinty was just remarkable, and he immediately picked up on this. So I've kind of taken, hopefully in my own way, that kind of insight and tried to point that out to the students in the sense that hopefully encourages them to take all of these sports as something that they should look upon seriously. So, really interesting question. Again, I can't speak for the students, but I think that that's certainly what I try to accomplish anyway.
I think maybe I can take over the role of moderator since no one's here. It is 1:05 Atlantic time, and we do have a break until 1:30. I'm going to leave the meeting and have a quick break, but I guess, of course, you guys can probably stay and keep chatting if you want. But I just wanted to say thank you to both our presenters. I really enjoyed both your presentations very much.